in a way, a lot of the questions have already been addressed, but I did want to go back to, you mentioned your mother, and I wondered whether your mother did engage with feminist magazines or it's some of the ideas from the feminist magazines, or whether you had any conversations with her about it.
Lots of conversations. She was quite open to the idea that women needed opportunity. And she was a typical migrant mother. You know, she wanted her kids to do well. She assumed that we'd take on a very traditional sort of domestic life. But that idea of having a life outside the home was particularly important to her. My father was abusive. My mother left for the last time, taking us when I was 14. She was a single parent, making an income, working as first a cleaner and then a chambermaid. You know, so there was not a lot of money around. She got issues like violence against women, the opportunity for women to have a job that would actually pay them enough to be independent if they wanted to be. And discussions around those subjects were very easy. You know, very often it was my mother saying, you've got to make sure that you can walk away if you want, that you can make choices if you want. You have got to work hard at school, you know, because you're the oldest and older children always work harder. And you have got to take responsibility for the rest of the family. Because when I'm gone, that's your job. And you just saw it as part and parcel of what you were reading in the magazines. She was quite resistant to actually looking at the magazines themselves, particularly after the picture of the guy with the bananas. Whoa! But when you talk to her about the ideas that were in there, that was absolutely, yeah, what's the phrase I'm looking for? You know, that just really reinforced stuff she was already thinking. Yeah.
That's so interesting, isn't it, Rosie? Because, you know, we've got this sense in which suddenly second wave feminism started in 1968. And in fact, our project starts then. But in fact, a lot of women were obviously politically active way before then, but also women like your mother who were switched on and kind of fully aware of how important, in particular, economic equality was.
And I think that you can't underestimate the degree to which the culture of a community has an impact on how people think. Luton is a very diverse area. I grew up with lots of South Asian, East Asian, and Afro-Caribbean people in the community around me. It was not a town free of racism by any means, and certainly the Irish community is not free of racism. But I made friends, and I can remember my friend Mahesari, who is Punjabi, talking to me about being a girl and then a young woman in a community that had very set ideas about what women were going to be like, and about the way that that sat so oddly with what she perceived as powerful and in charge women in her own family. And that discussion with other people and in the magazines about how women were persuaded to see themselves as in charge when actually they weren't, was really quite important. What did Betty Friedan call it?
The premium with no name, the feminine mystique.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that thing that's wrong that you can't put a finger on.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
That's what the magazines did. They were full of people articulating that thing that was wrong, and they were doing it in a very accessible way. I was reading Sally Alexander's book on becoming a woman recently, and I really enjoyed it. But at 16, that would have been rather heavy going for me. What Shrew and Spare Rib in particular did was give you other people's experience. It's that business of personal storytelling. You know, you connect to what you hear another person saying about their own life, and then you've got a context to slot it into. And the magazines were brilliant for that, absolutely brilliant.
I was going to say, do you remember contributing or sending in a letter or in any ways being further involved with the magazines besides just reading them? Or
no, what I did was, I think, what an awful lot of women did, and that was get involved in producing your own local material. And that took the form of those endless turgid newsletters that people were talking about at the library meeting. You know, the fact that you have something to say doesn't mean that you know how to say it. But it seemed really important to have local news networks, particularly in the era before the internet. It just has such huge impact on how we can communicate and organize. And I think one way or another, I have been writing and contributing to stuff ever since. And that's very much about that model of coming together and organizing that you got from the newsletter, from the newspaper, from the magazines. At the moment, I'm editor of the Northeast Labour History Journal, which is something I'll come back to because I think this project would be a really interesting article sometime. But that's just one of a series of publications that undoubtedly that I owe my involvement in to the magazines. Because the striking thing about them was that they were written by ordinary people. You didn't look at it and think, oh, she's a journalist. You thought that's somebody from a group somewhere writing about what they're doing, or that's somebody describing their own life. You know, and that was a style of journalism that I think started to change the media quite radically in the years that followed. And that's very much about the women's magazines. I'm trying to remember the article I can't remember which magazine it was in. Somebody did an article about washing up and about washing up bowls. You know, completely trivial, very funny. But it actually set you thinking about just how did you organize your own life so you actually had time and you could feel good about your environment, but you weren't endlessly locked into housework. And you did not see that sort of writing in the other women's magazines. My mother loved magazines like Woman's Realm, Women's Own. You know, we got those weekly. And you could see the start of changing attitudes to women and women's lives as the 70s rolled on. And the material that was in the women's liberation magazines started to become the sort of articles that you would see in those other magazines. You know, alongside all of the other stuff, they still carried on with the recipes and the knitting patterns. And that started to feel like something that you could emulate in your own writing. So certainly in terms of history, my interests are very often about the personal record and the recollections of people living through a particular event. One of the things that I used to do before lockdown was go into schools with domestic collections, handling collections and costumes, and get children to literally step into the lives of women from the past. And that has a huge impact. You know, putting on the sort of clothing that somebody wore gets you moving differently and kind of makes you realize what their life will have been like. You know, wearing 8 layers of petticoats in a muddy field tells you more about the experience of trying to do daily labor than almost anything else can do. Sorry, I'm going off the point again. It was a way of approaching the world that came from those magazines. And it was a way of approaching the world that my mother could connect to. You know, and that actually gave us a chance to talk about my ideas about what it meant to be a woman in a way that might not have been possible otherwise. You know, she was heading there, but I would never have thought to articulate a discussion about housework, for example, in terms of politics.
That's fascinating, absolutely fascinating.